Alright, I've been excited for this one. Imagine 30,000 people crammed into a space no bigger than 6 football fields. No government, no laws, not even sunlight. That place was real, and it was right here. This is Hong Kong, but if you go a few miles north, you hit Kowloon. And inside this city lived another city known as Kowloon Walled City. But wait, because there's nothing here but trees if you look right now. Where exactly is the city? Well, if we roll back the clock to 1990, suddenly a city filled with little natural light, triads, opium dens, prostitution, and more unchecked crime fades in. The most densely populated place on Earth. While some today may know it as Kowloon Walled City, to the people who lived outside it, it was simply the city of darkness. Now, before 1940, this dense city didn't even exist. So here's my big question. Where did Kowloon Walled City come from, and why did it vanish almost as quickly as it was built? Well, what I found made me completely rethink this place. If you're ready, let's dive in. Alright, from here on out, I'll simply refer to Kowloon Walled City as the Walled City. Our story begins in BCE Hong Kong. Imperial China has ruled the region now known as the Guangdong province from as early as 214 BCE, but remained largely untouched. That was until the 17th century, and the Qing Dynasty began expanding its military outposts in the region. One of these outposts was what would become the Walled City. By the late 1800s, we can start to see the area evolve. It's no longer just a lookout spot. There's a wall enclosing the area, cannons, about 200 civilians, more than 300 Qing officials, military personnel, and their dependents. And none of this is random. It reflected the Qing Dynasty's larger goal of implementing administration across their ever-growing empire. In fact, this map right here shows several of these walled cities that acted as administration spots for the Guangdong province. The thicker the walls on the map, the thicker the enclosure, which brings us to something very telling, the first clue into how this city became what it was. You see, the further right we go on the map, we spot the walled city, and it doesn't have any of these prominent walls illustrated. That's not an accident. To the Qing, this wasn't a fortress. It was a government office, an administrative complex, a government office that would become the most densely populated place on the planet. But before that could happen, something had to change, and that something was the British Empire. Following the First Opium War in 1842, China was forced to cede Hong Kong Island to Britain, but they kept the Kowloon Peninsula and the walled city within it. Naturally, like any strategic nation, they decided to beef up military operations in the area. If Britain was going to sit right next door, the Qing wanted eyes and ears on them. But then the Second Opium War broke out, and this time, in 1860, the consequences were far worse for China. Britain now controlled the Kowloon Peninsula, and they didn't stop there. In 1898, Britain secured a 99-year lease over the new territories, further expanding their reach in the area. In fact, here's a map showing what was drawn up, clearly indicating this is Britain's and this remains under Chinese rule. But this little dot here, that's the walled city. You see, China was hard-pressed to not give up this location. They still wanted some control or oversight in the region. Even if legally they weren't allowed to step in, this outlook would give them eyes and ears. There was just one problem. The walled city was now completely surrounded by British territory, which made it, well, rather difficult for China to actually govern. So the walled city became something that shouldn't exist, a legal gray zone, if you will. China had the claim, but Britain had the power, and neither would recognize the other's right to it, which meant that for the people who would eventually flood into this tiny patch of land, nobody was in charge. But by 1940, the walled city had been slowly decaying for decades. The Qing officials who once lived there were all but gone now, and all that remained was the Qing's centuries-old government office, a school, a couple homes, the wall, and about 400 squatters. It was barely a city, let alone a town. It became a forgotten relic until World War II. In 1941, Japanese forces invaded Hong Kong, and when they reached the walled city, instead of occupying it, they chose to demolish it. They tore down the ancient stone wall and used the materials to extend the runway at the new airport they were building. The very walls that gave the walled city its name were gone. So now I want you to picture this little patch of land. There's no walls, still no government or laws, and really no one paying attention. And even after Japan eventually surrendered in 1945 to the British, who reclaimed Hong Kong, that's how it remained. But here's where things get really interesting for me, because China was still in the midst of their civil war, nationalists versus the communists. This sent waves of refugees fleeing south. Thousands poured into Hong Kong looking for a place to live, but it was expensive, and the British weren't all that welcoming to them. So they continued searching until they stumbled upon this strange little legal gray zone, a place where neither the British nor the Chinese government could touch them. By 1947, more than 2,000 squatters had set up camp inside the walled city, their shacks miraculously arranged in almost the exact footprint of the original fort. No one wanted to step outside the confines of these man-made borders. Step past the line and, well, you were in British territory subject to British law. Inside, no law at all. But here's the thing. Britain saw this encampment of refugees and didn't like it. To them, it was full of lawless people. So in 1948, they sent police in, tore down the homes, and tried to clear the area. But within a week, the residents came back and rebuilt. And when the British tried again, this time riots broke out and the news spread across China. The Chinese government had all but forgotten about this little plot of land. But they viewed the rally cry from the refugees as an opportunity to restate their influence in the region. So the nationalist Chinese government seized it, loudly reminding Britain and the world that the walled city was sovereign Chinese territory. Britain did not want to deal with the international pressure and the reality that these people had nowhere else to go. So they backed down. And that decision changed everything. Britain ignored the place, and China did very little to control it. The walled city was no longer just attracting refugees. It was attracting anyone who wanted to escape and disappear. People fleeing debt, criminal charges, unlicensed doctors and dentists who couldn't practice anywhere else, and eventually the triads. And this freedom led them to build. But what they built wasn't what you'd expect. See, the government was gone. No laws, no building codes, and it was honestly an interesting first look at what a large ungoverned community would do. But it went how you'd likely expect. The criminal underworld started to move in. 5 of the deadliest triad groups began running the city. And what they built were brothels, gambling dens, the drug trade. The walled city had quickly become the epicenter of narcotics in Hong Kong. A single drug den was pulling in thousands of dollars a day for the gangs, and the operation was seamless. There were wire telephones connecting drug dens to outside lookouts. If the police came knocking, they'd relocate before they had the chance to find them. Heroin was passing through the hands of those affected by it. It was easy too. A single packet cost 20 cents. As the drugs started making their way outside the walled city, police came to try and calm it down. But the city was a maze. The operations would simply move upstairs where no one could find them. After a while, police didn't dare to enter unless they came in large groups, and even then they left empty-handed. But the triads weren't all bad. They did help with garbage disposal, settling disputes among neighbors, deciding who could run businesses, and even made sure some buildings had basic water and waste connections. You know, basic human things. And while the triads were controlling the city from the shadows, something else was happening in the light. Residents were building. Not architects, not engineers, not city planners, just people. In the 1950s, there were mostly low-rise 2 to 3 story structures made of whatever materials people could get their hands on. But pretty soon, more families needed a roof, shopkeepers needed a storefront, factory owners needed a floor, and one by one, they built a city from scratch. The one and really only rule was that if you were there first, the spot was yours. That is, until a more formal system evolved. By the 1960s, something started to shift. Buildings began going vertical, 6 stories, 8 stories, 10, 14. Those initial 2,000 squatters after World War II had grown to tens of thousands, and they needed a place to live. But if they went outside the border, the British would seize control. So they built up, without an expert engineer or architect. Of the roughly 350 buildings, it all looks like one big building from above. But homes smaller than 200 square feet, housing multiple people, touching walls with their neighbors, and likely they didn't have the basic electricity or pipes that we all have today. The point is, none of this was planned. Well, one thing was planned. Buildings could not be higher than 14 stories. Remember the airport I mentioned earlier that the Japanese built during the war? Well, it was still functioning, and it was really close to the walled city. If they built one story higher, they'd risk clipping the wings of incoming 747s. So if your city is locked within 6.4 acres, you can't build higher than 14 floors, how do you make room for people still coming to the city? Well, you build inwards. Alleys became smaller, barely 3 feet wide. Lights hung outside buildings to provide some form of light. Residents carried umbrellas, not just for the rain, but because of leaking pipes from above. And those pipes are an important aspect to this story. But first, here's the detail that I think says everything about this place. Travel was only made possible through an informal network of staircases and passageways on the upper floors, so extensive that you could travel from one end of the city to the other without ever touching the ground. But here's where the other side of the story comes in, because to make this city function, people had to solve problems like traveling from one side to the other without a government. People needed water, electricity, jobs. So how did they do it? Let's start with water. Until the 80s, residents relied on people to deliver water from several wells owned by different suppliers. But the water they were getting wasn't clean. Not to mention, they were spending $50 a month for essentially sewage water. The Hong Kong government did step in during the 1960s to install a small number of public standpipes that could be accessed during specific times of the day. But the part that really shocked me was the electricity. Electricity in the walled city wasn't really a system. It was a sprawl of illegal connections, cables sneaking through alleyways tapped into Hong Kong's official grid by whoever could reach it. But there lies the problem. The more people connected, the more the network strained. And the more it strained, the more dangerous it got. That came to a head in 1977 when the overloaded, unregulated wiring sparked a massive fire that tore through the city. Hong Kong's utility company saw it as a turning point. Working with the Kai Fong Association, the residents' council that served as the city's de facto government, they drafted a plan to run proper wiring through the city's buildings. It was no small job. Workers ran wires along walls, through shops, up buildings floor by floor, and despite constant disputes over access into people's homes, they pushed through. But wiring alone didn't solve the problem. Without substations, there was no legitimate power source feeding those cables. Residents were still ultimately tapping Hong Kong's external grid without meters and without paying. So theft continued, just in a more organized form and with a much lower risk of fire. It took years more of negotiations before the government approved permanent electrical substations in 1984, the infrastructure that would finally give the city its own stable power supply, instead of bleeding off the grid illegally. It took several more years to build them, by which point, the clock in the city was already running out. But what about sewage and garbage? The Hong Kong government finally only installed mains because raw waste was becoming a public health crisis that affected people beyond the city's borders. Okay, none of this sounds like a place someone would want to live. It's dark, gloomy, little power, crime, and so much more. How did people live here? I'll get to that, because so far we've only looked at the infrastructure, built from nothing by people with nothing, while the government outside pretended the city didn't exist. But to the people inside, it very much did exist. People built hundreds of small factories inside the walled city. Entire families worked the production lines. They made fish balls, noodles, candies, textiles, plastic goods, and even golf balls. There was a cotton mill, metal fabrications shot up, and so much more. Those products poured into Hong Kong and the rest of the world. The economics were staggering. One resident later shared how he rented a roughly 80 square foot space for $6 a month and made $5,000 to $6,000 monthly. He sold pineapple slices for $4 to $5 each, while a box just cost him $20. Outside the city, you'd need licenses, government approvals, inspections, but inside, you just open for business. In the 1970s, $1 a day was enough to feed a family of 5. It was truly mind-boggling. Unlicensed doctors and dentists, many of them trained in mainland China but unable to practice under British Hong Kong's regulations, set up clinics throughout the city. They were affordable and accessible to people who had no other options. And here's what's fascinating. People from outside the walled city actually came in specifically to see these doctors because they were affordable. Despite all the taboo that was being talked about outside, they had little problem coming in when they needed medical help. Walking deeper into the city, the corridors offered glimpses into smoke-filled rooms. The incessant click of mahjong tiles echoed along the walls. Every afternoon, the alleys came alive with the sound. Gambling parlors lined up alongside strip clubs. Shops and food stalls crowded along streets with names like Big Well Street, Bright Street, and Dragon City Road. For the adventurous, dog and snake meat were specialties. The city also had a postal service, a small team that made up the system as they went along. All these tiny crowded spaces were the city's pulse. But beyond all the darkness, just above the roof, was its breath. Children would play there, jumping from one building to the other. There were cages for pigeon racing, and a local orchestra met there twice a week to play. Residents gathered at the center of the city where remnants of the Qing Dynasty remained. They drank tea, watched television, took calligraphy classes. Grandmothers watched over the neighborhood while wives handled housekeeping as their families worked the factory lines. It was a well-oiled machine. The crime was only a part of the city to those who lived inside. Ask former residents, and some say what they miss most is the community. But there's no denying that the city had a slate of problems: rats, sewage, sanitation. People fell victim to the drugs made easily accessible there. Some residents even recounted the skin of those who fell victim as being worse than oil burns. There's no denying that the triads who originally ran the city left a dark shadow over it. But there was change. Younger residents in the 70s wanted their home cleaned. So, Hong Kong police launched over 3,500 raids into the walled city. They made arrests and seized hundreds of pounds of narcotics. By 1983, the city's crime rate was deemed under control. So, here's where we've come. A city built almost overnight, run by triads, brothels on one side of the street, and a priest handing out powdered milk on the other, medical services next to noodle factories, utility problems that took creativity and grit to solve, kids jump off roofs, racing pigeons, and a community focused on helping each other inside. This was the walled city, a place that was somehow all of these things at once. But wait, the city started troublesome, sure, but it was turning a new leaf. Why doesn't it exist today? Well, just as complex and difficult as it was to grow this city, the decision to tear it down was just as easy. December 19th, 1984, Britain and China have just signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration. The 99-year lease Britain held over Hong Kong would finally come to an end on July 1st, 1997. China had been using the walled city as a bargaining chip over Britain for years, so with them finally having control back over Hong Kong and the new territories, both governments agreed to tear it down. To them, the city was still riddled with crime, sanitation issues, congestion, and a real fire hazard. A lot of the city wasn't up to code, but rather than try to fix it, they wanted it gone. Okay, but why didn't the people just riot like they did back in the 40s? What were they going to do with tens of thousands of people? Well, they kept the plan secret. For 6 months before the announcement, the Hong Kong Housing Department kept the walled city under surveillance, quietly counting residents, documenting businesses, gathering evidence of who actually lived there. They had to, because they were about to buy everyone out, and they didn't want a sudden surge in people claiming they lived there. Then, January 14th, 1987, 400 officials from the housing department descended on the walled city, with a sole mission to contact and survey every single resident. Earlier that day, the Hong Kong government announced the city would be redeveloped as a public park. The Chinese Foreign Ministry made the same announcement. There was no escape this time. No more legal gray zone in a contract spanning a century. The government planned to compensate residents with over 2.7 billion Hong Kong dollars. On average, residents received around $140,000 in today's US dollar for the apartment no bigger than 200 square feet. For many, this was life-changing money, and negotiations dragged on for years. Most people accepted. By November 1991, roughly 450 households out of thousands had yet to agree. But not everyone left willingly. About 80 residents staged a sit-in outside the governor's house to protest forced evictions. Some had lived there for 30 years. Others had built businesses that couldn't exist anywhere else. Remember, a lot of this city's economy ran on unlicensed doctors, the factory owners, the small entrepreneurs who had thrived specifically because there were no regulations, no taxes, no licenses. But in the end, even the people who built the city recognized it had run its course. When asked, some residents estimated that 90% of people were fine with the decision. It was the other 10%, mostly business owners, who fought the hardest. Because for them, the walled city wasn't just a home, it was the only place in Hong Kong where their livelihood was possible. But their protests wouldn't last forever. On July 2nd, 1992, riot police entered the city and forced out the last remaining residents. A tall wired fence was erected around the entire perimeter, following almost exactly the line once marked by the original granite wall that the Japanese had torn down half a century earlier. The walled city was empty. On March 23, 1993, a wrecking ball swung into the side of an 8-story tower. It was a single ceremonial swing. The real work of demolishing the city would begin several weeks later. It took a year to tear it down piece by piece until there was nothing left except for little remnants of the original city that had survived for centuries. One read Southgate, the other Kowloon Walled City. A piece of the original identity of the city had still survived. From an outpost during the Qing Dynasty to a refugee camp, all the way to a bustling city full of life and darkness. Over the next year, the walled city would turn into what it is today, a landscape park with pieces that pay homage to the land's history. Now, there's so much more to the story, and I couldn't put everything into one single video. So if you're still curious, please visit the resources below and share your favorite facts about this place. And until next time, stay curious.